South Korea has a population problem.
South Korea is facing a demographic crisis.
The birth rate has dropped so dramatically.
South Korea's population fell for the first time this year.
At the current rate, the pool of military servicemen is expected to shrink by 20 to 30,000.
But what does that have to do with South Korea's rifle squad? South Korea's infertility rate poses a real national security challenge, as there's going to be fewer and fewer men to conscript for military service going into the future. There's multiple issues that may have caused this, from rising costs of living and raising a family to gender inequality in the workplace. We won't be getting into all of that, but what we will do is give an overview of how a declining population is affecting South Korea's army, and more specifically, its rifle squad. And if you don't care about that, we'll still be telling you how the South Korean squad is organized and equipped. I'm your host Brendan, and this is Battle Order. First, I'd just like to thank the Brigade who allow us to cover more interesting but less popular topics. If you want to help Battle Order grow and get a bunch of perks, including early access to videos and private chat on our Discord server, join the Brigade over at patreon.com/battleorder. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Tank Encyclopedia magazine, which for just $5 features a bunch of well-researched articles on armored vehicles throughout history, backed up by amazing illustrations. If you know Tank Encyclopedia, you know they're a great resource for anything to do with tanks, and are pretty much the only people doing what they're doing right now. So pick up a digital copy today on their PayHip, linked in the description. But on to the topic at hand. Before we get to the rifle squad, let's start with some context. In response to population decline, the South Korean military is drastically reducing its size to cope. Up until now, the army has bore the entirety of this burden. Since 2017, the Army has reduced its active duty personnel from 483,000 to 420,000, a 13% decrease in 4 years. At least in the short term, this downward trend is going to continue, all the way to 365,000 by 2022. Wide-scale reductions come hand in hand with the conscription term being shortened from 22 to 18 months, a politically savvy move to be sure, since conscription is generally unpopular in South Korea. Reserves will also be receiving steep cuts. The Mobilization Reserve, which consists of reservists who have finished their active conscription but may still be mobilized for war, will be reduced from 1.3 million to 950,000. This will result in the dismantling, reshuffling, and downsizing of units from the regiment and up. The active duty force structure is going to be reorganized from 8 corps composed of 35 divisions to 6 corps with 33 divisions by 2025. As smaller units are being made to cover more area, increasing operational mobility and force multiplication will be key. One measure to do so was the conversion of regiments to brigades, purportedly to afford them greater independence and mobility. The core principle is creating combined arms units that can conduct operations without divisional support. Combined with desires to increase motorization, broadly speaking, will be the main means of increasing units' freedom of action. At the same time, new technologies are being sought after to make up for manpower deficiencies. The theory is improved firepower, the integration of force multipliers, and the proliferation of unmanned technologies can allow South Korea to maintain or even increase combat effectiveness despite its shrinking size. However, at least for the infantryman's kit, modernization hasn't gone exactly to plan. There have been some positive developments, such as the modernization of the service rifle, squad automatic weapon, and the procurement of new night vision goggles from L3 Harris. But there have been blunders as well. For example, the K11 compound rifle, similar in concept to the XM29 OICW, was cancelled in 2019 on account of defects and corruption. Additionally, many of the components of the Warrior program, which is a holistic program to modernize the kit of Korean soldiers, have been reported as being defective in huge quantities. One report found that the average defect rate of optics and IR designators inspected in early 2021 was 26%. This has largely been chalked up to a faulty procurement process where the Army blindly contracts with a company that underbids by a significant margin. As for the squad itself, it's going to remain familiar, but it will be receiving some personnel shakeups and new equipment in line with the larger scale changes we've just covered. But first, let's look at what it was originally. Prior to changes announced in 2019, the squad consisted of 8 men in peacetime and 10 in wartime. It came under the overall leadership of a squad leader. Depending on the unit, they could rank Hassa, which is functionally equivalent to a US Army Staff Sergeant and is South Korea's first NCO and volunteer rank. However, they may more commonly rank Pyeongjang, which is the highest junior enlisted and conscript rank. While the English word for the rank is sergeant, it's not an NCO grade. Squad leaders can be distinguished from the rest of the squad by a green addition to their epaulets. It seems the squad leader was usually armed with the new K2C1 rifle, possibly with a day-night optic combo. However, in specialty units like recon, mechanized, or special forces, we've been told leadership could also be armed with the shorter K1 carbine instead. The squad leader was aided by an assistant squad leader who was armed similarly and ranked sergeant. As a base of fire, each squad had a machine gunner, armed with a K3 belt-fed light machine gun. Some sources state that this gunner had an assistant to aid them, as was the case when the M60 GPMG was in use instead. However, one service member we've talked to said in their unit, the machine gunner carries all their own ammunition and doesn't operate with an assistant at all. This kind of detail is often something that varies unit from unit in other militaries, so we can't say definitively if an assistant on the MG is standard practice in the Army. In addition to the K3, the squad also had 2 grenadiers, each with an old K2 rifle with a K201 underbarrel grenade launcher. The reason the K2 is used rather than the K2C1 is because the grenade launcher's mounting system was for the K2. The South Koreans were originally planning to replace the K201 with the K11 compound rifle, but that program fell through, so now they're awaiting future procurement. The active duty complement in the squad was then rounded out by 2 riflemen, each armed with a K2C1. All of these soldiers could rank anywhere from the South Korean equivalent of private to lance corporal or corporal. This 8-man configuration was the squad's peacetime state, but if war were declared, an additional 2 reservists would be added to the squad. They'd act as riflemen, typically armed with the old K2 rifle, or before the K2C1 came online for the frontline units, Vietnam vintage M16A1s. As for the internal structure, we've been told by service members that there are no fire teams, at least in their experience. Thus, the squad fires and moves as a single entity. We're unsure if this is unit dependent though, and it seems to differ from the Marine Corps, who do have a half and half fire team structure. But they're also different in other ways too, such as having 2 K3 machine guns instead of just 1. But back to the present, the biggest change for the squad is that reservists will no longer be integrated during wartime. Rather, the mobilization reserves will be in their own reserve units. This will likely have a few follow-on effects. There is the obvious factor that there won't be as many reservists in the future, so reducing the demand for them makes sense. However, doing so will also likely increase the readiness of the mostly active duty frontline units, since they won't be delayed by the mobilization of reserves. Reserves won't have to be reintegrated and retrained by the units, which can be an issue since they only receive a couple of weeks of refresher training a year. Plus, units won't have to keep a separate cache of weapons to arm reservists anymore. Thus, during wartime, the rifle squad will have a more uniform standard for training and equipment. In addition to structural changes, we'll also likely see the integration of the new K15 belt-fed light machine gun into the squad in the early 2020s, which replaced the old and unreliable K3. If you enjoyed this video on South Korea's rifle squad, check out this recent video on Japan's tank force, where we give a deep dive on future changes coming to Japan's armored units and equipment. We'll see you over there.